18:37. Imagine being the most powerful monarch on Earth, ruling an empire that spans a quarter of the globe, commanding armies and navies that no other nation can match. You have palaces, servants, wealth beyond measure, the love of your people. And then in one December afternoon, all of it becomes meaningless. Your husband dies in your arms at age 42, and in that moment, your world ends. You're only 42 yourself. You will live another 40 years. And for every single one of those 14,000 days, you will wear black. You will sleep next to his clothes laid out on the bed, as if he might return. You will have his shaving water brought fresh every morning, though he's been dead for decades. You will retreat from public life so completely that your own government will consider forcing you to abdicate. This is what happened to Queen Victoria after Prince Albert died in 1861. And what she did in her grief was so extreme, so all-consuming, so bizarre that it nearly destroyed the British monarchy and created a cult of mourning that would define an entire era. Before we explore one of the most extreme cases of prolonged grief in history, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these fascinating stories from the past. And if you're already intrigued by how Queen Victoria's 40-year mourning period changed Britain forever, show your support by leaving a like right now. It really helps the channel grow. Now let's step into Windsor Castle on December 14th, 1861, and witness the moment that would transform Queen Victoria from a beloved monarch into the widow of Windsor, who would haunt British palaces in black for the rest of her life. Prince Albert died at 10:50 p.m. on December 14th, 1861, in the Blue Room at Windsor Castle. He was 42 years old. The official cause of death was typhoid fever, though modern medical analysis suggests it might have been stomach cancer, Crohn's disease, or another chronic condition. Victoria had been at his bedside constantly for days, watching him deteriorate, refusing to believe he could actually die. When the end came, she threw herself on his body, screaming and sobbing, and had to be physically pulled away by her physicians and ladies-in-waiting. What happened next would shape the rest of her life and reign. Victoria didn't just mourn Albert. She turned mourning into a permanent state of being, a performance of grief so extreme and sustained that it dominated British culture for decades and created the Victorian obsession with death, mourning rituals, and elaborate funeral customs that we still associate with the era. The immediate aftermath of Albert's death was chaotic and disturbing. Victoria became hysterical, unable to function. She refused to sleep, refused to eat, spent hours screaming and crying. Her physician, Dr. James Clark, feared she was having a complete mental breakdown. He prescribed laudanum, opium dissolved in alcohol, which Victoria began taking regularly and would continue using for the rest of her life. For the first weeks after Albert's death, Victoria was essentially incapacitated. She couldn't make decisions, couldn't meet with ministers, couldn't perform any of her royal duties. The government had to function without her, a constitutional crisis that nobody quite knew how to handle. The Prime Minister, Lord Palmerston, and other ministers were deeply concerned, but also had no idea how to deal with a monarch who had essentially checked out of reality. Victoria's first decision, when she could function enough to make decisions, was that nothing in Albert's rooms would ever be changed. Nothing. The Blue Room where he died was to be preserved exactly as it was at the moment of his death. His clothes were to remain laid out. His personal items were to stay in their places. Fresh flowers were to be placed in the room daily. Hot water for shaving was to be brought to his rooms every morning and his chamber pot emptied every night as if he were still alive. This wasn't just for a few weeks or months. This continued for the remaining 40 years of Victoria's life. Every single day, servants brought shaving water to a dead man's rooms. Every night, they laid out his nightclothes on the bed. For 40 years, the rooms became shrines, frozen in time, visited by Victoria like a pilgrim visiting a holy site. But it went further. Victoria insisted that Windsor Castle be maintained as a kind of mausoleum. She rarely stayed there because it reminded her too painfully of Albert's death. But when she did visit, the atmosphere was oppressive. Servants were instructed to move silently, to speak in whispers. Laughter was forbidden. Any kind of joy or levity was seen as disrespectful to Albert's memory. Victoria's personal mourning costume was extreme even by Victorian standards, and Victoria mourning was already extremely elaborate. She wore only black for the rest of her life, a full 40 years of unrelieved black clothing. Not even the dark colors that were acceptable after the first year of mourning, just solid black. Her widow's cap with its long black veil became her signature look, worn every single day whether she was meeting with prime ministers, reviewing troops, or sitting alone in her rooms. She demanded that everyone around her dress in mourning as well. Her children, her household, her servants, all were required to wear black or dark colors constantly. Even visitors to court were expected to dress in mourning for Albert, a man most of them had never met, years and even decades after his death. The entire royal court became a permanent funeral. Victoria's bedroom became perhaps the most disturbing manifestation of her grief. She moved Albert's photograph and a plaster cast of his hand to her bedside. She would kiss the photograph every night before sleeping and again every morning upon waking. She slept with his nightshirt under her pillow. She had his clothes laid out on the bed beside her each night as if he were still sleeping there. In her sitting room, she set up what was essentially an altar to Albert. His bust sat in a prominent position, surrounded by photographs. She burned candles before it. She would sit for hours staring at his image, talking to him as if he could hear her. She believed, or wanted to believe, that his spirit was present, watching over her, guiding her. Victoria's withdrawal from public life after Albert's death was nearly total. She refused to appear in public for years. She wouldn't attend the state opening of Parliament, one of the monarch's most important ceremonial duties. She wouldn't hold courts or levees where she would meet with aristocracy and officials. She essentially vanished from public view, hiding in her palaces while still expecting to exercise all the powers and receive all the honors of monarchy. This created a serious political problem. The British constitutional monarchy depended on the monarch being visible, performing ceremonial functions, representing the nation. Victoria's refusal to do any of this led to a growth in Republican sentiment. Newspapers criticized her. Pamphlets appeared questioning whether Britain needed a queen who did nothing. There were genuine discussions in Parliament about whether Victoria should be forced to abdicate in favor of her son, the Prince of Wales. Victoria didn't care. She was completely absorbed in her grief and in preserving Albert's memory. She began writing a memoir of Albert, a worshipful account of his life and their marriage that portrayed him as essentially perfect, a saint who could do no wrong. She published portions of this and forced the publication of his speeches and letters, all aimed at cementing his reputation as a great man and thinker. She also embarked on an extraordinary building campaign of memorials to Albert. The most famous is the Albert Memorial in Kensington Gardens, London, a massive Gothic monument with a gilded statue of Albert seated under an elaborate canopy. It cost £120,000, an enormous sum in the 1860s, all from public funds that many British taxpayers resented spending to memorialize a foreign prince consort who had never been particularly popular during his lifetime. But the Albert Memorial was just the beginning. Victoria commissioned statues of Albert for cities across Britain and the Empire. She had memorials built in Scotland, Wales, Ireland. She renamed buildings and institutions after him. She created the Albert Medal. She did everything possible to ensure that Albert would never be forgotten, that his name would be permanently linked with her reign. The Royal Albert Hall, one of London's most famous concert venues, was built as a memorial to Albert. The Albert Bridge across the Thames. The Albert Dock in Liverpool. Albert Square in Manchester. Town after town across Britain gained Albert memorials, statues, fountains, all commissioned or encouraged by Victoria in her determination that Albert's memory be preserved forever. She also commissioned the building of a mausoleum at Frogmore, near Windsor Castle, where Albert's body was interred. This mausoleum was an elaborate structure designed in Italian Romanesque style, lavishly decorated with marble, sculptures, and stained glass. Victoria visited it constantly, sometimes multiple times a week, sitting beside Albert's tomb for hours. She arranged for her own tomb to be built there beside his, planning every detail of her own funeral and burial decades in advance. Victoria's relationship with her children deteriorated badly after Albert's death, largely because she blamed them, particularly the Prince of Wales, for contributing to Albert's death. The logic was twisted, but in Victoria's grief-stricken mind it made sense. Albert had been upset by the Prince of Wales's scandalous behavior, particularly his sexual affair with an actress. Albert had traveled to Cambridge in November 1861 to confront his son about this scandal. He had gotten wet and cold during that trip. Victoria convinced herself that this trip had weakened Albert's constitution and led to his final illness. She blamed the Prince of Wales for killing his father. She told him this directly and repeatedly. Her relationship with her eldest son and heir, who would eventually become Edward VII, was poisoned by this accusation. For years, she could barely stand to be in the same room with him. She excluded him from government business, refused to give him any meaningful role or responsibility, and treated him with cold contempt. Her daughters fared little better. Victoria expected them to serve as her companions and mourners, to share her perpetual grief and isolation. Princess Alice and Princess Helena particularly suffered, required to stay with their mother, to read to her, to listen to her endless reminiscences about Albert, to never marry or leave or have independent lives. When they did eventually marry, Victoria resented them for abandoning her. Princess Beatrice, the youngest daughter, was kept in complete thrall to her mother's grief. Victoria decided that Beatrice would never marry, that she would remain with Victoria as a permanent companion. When Beatrice dared to fall in love and want to marry, Victoria didn't speak to her daughter for months, punishing her with silence for the crime of wanting a life of her own. Eventually, Beatrice was allowed to marry, but only on condition that she and her husband live with Victoria and that Beatrice remain Victoria's constant companion. Victoria's daily routine in the years and decades after Albert's death became rigidly structured around her mourning. She would wake and immediately pray at Albert's image. She would read his letters and writings. She would visit his rooms or his mausoleum. She surrounded herself with people who had known Albert, who could talk about him, who would indulge her need to constantly discuss him. She refused almost all social activities. No parties, no balls, no celebrations. Christmas, which Albert had loved and had helped popularize in Britain by introducing the German tradition of Christmas trees, became unbearable to Victoria. She went through the motions of celebrating for her household and family, but took no joy in it, seeing it only as another reminder of her loss. Her ladies-in-waiting and household staff found serving Victoria during this period extremely difficult. She was demanding, temperamental, and completely self-absorbed in her grief. She would summon them at odd hours to listen to her talk about Albert. She would burst into tears without warning. She would rage at small things that reminded her of him or that she felt dishonored his memory. She also became obsessed with spiritualism and the possibility of contacting Albert beyond the grave. This was a period when spiritualism was fashionable, with seances and mediums becoming popular among the upper classes. Victoria attended seances, hoping to communicate with Albert's spirit. She consulted mediums, some of whom were obvious frauds, but whom Victoria wanted to believe. One of her servants, John Brown, a Scottish gillie who had served Albert, became extremely important to Victoria during this period. Brown had been a favorite of Albert's, and Victoria found comfort in his presence because he reminded her of her husband. But Brown became far more than just a comforting presence. He became Victoria's closest companion, her most trusted advisor, and possibly her lover, though this remains historically uncertain. The relationship with John Brown scandalized Victorian society. Here was the Queen of England, the Empress of India, the most powerful woman in the world, and she was spending all her time with a Scottish servant, taking his advice, allowing him liberties that no servant should have, possibly even sleeping with him. Rumors spread. Newspapers hinted. Cartoons appeared showing Victoria and Brown in compromising situations. Victoria didn't care. She made Brown her personal servant, gave him rooms in all her palaces, consulted him on everything, and defended him fiercely when anyone criticized him. When Brown died in 1883, Victoria mourned him almost as intensely as she had mourned Albert, though she was more restrained because she understood the political dangers of showing too much grief for a servant. Victoria's political activity during her long mourning period was inconsistent and often problematic. She would refuse to meet with ministers, claiming her grief made it impossible, but then would interfere in policy, sending long letters demanding that things be done her way. She played favorites among politicians, supporting those who flattered her and opposed those who questioned her. Her relationship with prime ministers varied wildly. She adored Benjamin Disraeli, who shamelessly flattered her and treated her with exaggerated deference, always mentioning Albert and praising his wisdom. She despised William Gladstone, who treated her as a constitutional monarch with limited power and refused to indulge her pretensions or her grief. Her feud with Gladstone lasted decades and damaged the functioning of government. The public's view of Victoria during her long mourning period shifted over time. Initially, there was sympathy. She had lost her husband. She was grieving. It was understandable. But as months became years and years became decades, sympathy turned to frustration and then to anger. Why was the Queen taking enormous sums from taxpayers while refusing to perform her duties? Why were their palaces maintained at public expense that she barely visited? Why should Britain tolerate an absent monarch? Republican sentiment grew significantly in the 1870s. Public meetings were held calling for the abolition of the monarchy. Pamphlets circulated arguing that Britain could function perfectly well as a republic and would save enormous amounts of money by getting rid of the expensive, useless royal family. These movements never achieved majority support, but they were serious enough to worry Victoria's advisors and family. What saved the monarchy was a combination of factors. Victoria's ministers eventually convinced her to make more public appearances, though she did so reluctantly and minimally. The empire was expanding and creating renewed patriotic sentiment that attached to the crown. In Victoria's Golden and Diamond Jubilees in 1887 and 1897, celebrating 50 and 60 years on the throne, created massive public celebrations that reminded people of the continuity and tradition the monarchy represented. But Victoria never stopped mourning. Even at her jubilees, she wore black. Even at public celebrations, she made references to Albert and how he would have felt or what he would have wanted. She remained the widow of Windsor, defined by her loss, until the day she died in January 1901 at age 81. Victoria's extended mourning had a profound impact on British and broader Western culture. The elaborate Victorian mourning customs, the black clothing, the mourning jewelry made from the hair of the deceased, the draped mirrors and stopped clocks in houses where someone had died, the complex rules about mourning periods, all of this was influenced and amplified by Victoria's example. When Victoria mourned for 40 years, it made extended mourning seem not just acceptable, but admirable. It created a culture where grief was performed publicly, where elaborate displays of mourning demonstrated love and respectability. This reached absurd levels, with etiquette books specifying exactly what to wear and how to behave during first mourning, second mourning, half mourning, each stage with its own rules. The cult of death that characterized Victorian culture, the elaborate funerals, the memorial photography, including post-mortem photographs of the deceased, the elaborate cemetery monuments, all of this was influenced by Victoria's obsessive memorialization of Albert. If the Queen spent fortunes building memorials to her dead husband, then middle-class families needed impressive headstones and annual visits to 10 graves. Psychologically, Victoria's extended grief was clearly pathological by any modern standard. Her inability to move past Albert's death, her creation of shrines, her conversations with his image, her preservation of his rooms, all of this indicates an unhealthy inability to process grief and accept loss. In modern times, she would have been diagnosed with complicated grief disorder or prolonged grief disorder and would have received psychological treatment. But in Victorian times, there was no such understanding. Grief was seen as an appropriate emotion that demonstrated love. The longer and more intensely you grieved, the more you had loved the deceased. Victoria's extreme mourning was interpreted by many as evidence of her deep love for Albert, not as a mental health crisis that needed intervention. The impact on Victoria's children was profound and often damaging. They grew up in a house of permanent mourning, where their dead father was more present than some of their living siblings. They were constantly compared to Albert and found wanting. They were expected to grieve a man that some of them barely remembered. The psychological damage this caused manifested in various ways, from the Prince of Wales's notorious womanizing and pursuit of pleasure to several daughters' depression and mental health issues. Victoria's mourning also had political consequences that extended well beyond Britain. As Queen of the United Kingdom and Empress of India, Victoria's personal behavior affected international relations and perceptions of the British Empire. Her withdrawal from public life at a time when European monarchies were facing revolutionary pressures made the British monarchy seem weak and outdated. Her refusal to attend her son's wedding to Princess Alexandra of Denmark in 1863 because she was in mourning was a diplomatic embarrassment. Her insistence on wearing black at all state occasions made her seem morbid and strange to foreign dignitaries accustomed to the pomp and ceremony of other European courts. Yet somehow the monarchy survived and even thrived despite Victoria's bizarre behavior. This was partly because Britain's constitutional system meant that government could function without an active monarch. Ministers, parliament, and civil servants ran the country while Victoria mourned. She retained veto power and influence, but wasn't essential to daily governance. When Victoria finally died in 1901, she left specific instructions that she was to be buried in white, not black, and that her coffin was to include items connected to both Albert and John Brown. She wanted to be reunited with Albert in death, laid beside him in the mausoleum she had built at Frogmore. Her funeral was one of the largest state occasions in British history, attended by royalty from across Europe, but also marked the end of an era. The Victorian age, defined so completely by Victoria's personality and her prolonged mourning, ended with her death. The new King Edward VII immediately changed the atmosphere of the royal court, bringing back color, celebration, and social occasions. He had spent his entire adult life waiting to be king while his mother mourned, and he was determined to enjoy his reign. This is how Queen Victoria lived after Albert's death. 40 years of black clothing, sealed rooms, daily rituals of mourning, isolation, and obsessive memorialization. It was one of the most extreme examples of prolonged grief in history, sustained by someone with unlimited resources to indulge her sorrow and unchecked power that let her impose her grief on everyone around her. It nearly destroyed the British monarchy, created a culture of death and mourning that defined an era, and demonstrated that even the most powerful person in the world could become completely trapped by grief, unable to move forward, frozen in time at the moment of loss, waiting 40 years to be reunited with the person they had lost.